Welcome back to Abundant Culture Podcast,
where we dissect the mindsets and tactics of the true beasts of business.
People like Gary Vee, Grant Cardone, and Warren Buffett.
All to create a blueprint to experience life more abundantly. Hey everybody, so glad to have you back today. At Abundant Culture, you know for sure that we absolutely, positively love capitalism. But because of all the envy and greed and hate that we experience in our society today, a lot of times capitalism can get a bad rep. But we believe in compassion with capitalism. We believe in people over profit. We believe in conscious capitalism. We believe in all of these things. And our guest today also does. So we're going to be talking about that today with our guest, Andy Swindler.
Thank you again, Andy, for coming onto the podcast. We had an amazing talk a couple of weeks ago that lasted for like 2 hours or however long it was. So we really wanted our audience to get a peek into what that conversation was about because it was like super philosophical. It was definitely needed, and we cannot wait for them to hear it. So before we begin into the meat and potatoes of the podcast, of the content, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, how you got into business?
Absolutely. So we've got a lot of pressure to recreate that whole conversation. Excuse me. So I got into business when I was about 24. I had actually studied journalism, and I was lucky to have a computer when I was pretty young. So I'd always been playing around with computers, was pretty good at it. And I had worked at a web design company. This was right through the dot-com bubble bursting, and so everything was inflated and overly excited. And thankfully, web design wasn't quite as dramatically affected as some of the other inflated, pieces of the investment world. But the company I was with, a small company, went away, and one of my colleagues, one of the partners, we formed another company to pick up the pieces and what was left. And that was a strange year because it was sort of bouncing around. I think that version of that company only lasted for 4 months, and then was sort of bouncing around doing some other things. And then all the old clients started calling me. And, I made a decision ethically. I wasn't going to go chase them or anything. But one by one, they started calling me. And really the business was born out of that. The idea that I had left an impression, I had done good work, I had built good relationships. And I actually had already had an idea to go out on my own. So I had created a brand, but put it on the shelf, and then thought, okay, I'll just do this. Why not? Like the pieces are coming together. And that was also an age when, obviously people have been solo for a long time, but that was right about, I think, when it became much easier to run an entire business on a cell phone and a laptop. Yeah. Just even easier now with all the administrative tools and apps and things we have available. So that was it. So my first company, Aztec, was born, and that lasted for 14 years. I had at least one other startup in the middle of that along the way. So yeah, I just love kicking off new things.
Awesome. So basically, your first business kind of piggybacked off of a company that you were a part of. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. These were relationships I had essentially built while working at another company.
Okay.
When that company went away, these clients were like, hey, we still need these things to be done. The market need was.
Yeah. So would you say that in a way that the company you work for kind of helped to prepare you and give you the resources that you needed in order to kind of, jump into your own, thing? And like what, I guess the question is, what did they prepare you for, and what were you totally not prepared for when you actually started your business?
Great question. So on the one hand, just the mere notion that it could be done. I think so much of what holds people back is some kind of belief system or maybe just never even occurring to them that they could go out and start a company or go out and just start working or freelancing or just, following their dreams and their passions. If you fast forward, which I assume we'll get to, like, that's so much what I work on now as a purpose coach, is like, how do we work on those belief systems? So, first of all, it was just like, I was living in, the company was tiny, it was 5 people. And so just living inside the belief system that somebody could just go do that. So it was never a question. And I don't know how much we'll get into it. I also now recognize there's some privileges involved with that as well. The fact that I do have certain privileges that make it easier for me to go do that. So the other thing I learned, I certainly learned some things about what not to do, and, where to put the energy and where to put the money and all those things. But maybe even more importantly, I learned how hard it is. It's so much easier. And I was pretty young, so I was a bit arrogant about it. Just sitting there assuming, oh, well, they don't know what they're doing, and this should be this way, and that should be that way. And when I didn't have all the information, right, I didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle, and I'd never done it myself. And so that's a big lesson for anybody in any situation. I think it's just, don't assume what's going on, and especially when it comes to entrepreneurship, as you both know, it is much, much harder than people often think it is. It's easy to glamorize. It's easy to just think, yeah, that's that easy. There's this saying, it's like, why would you, instead of spending 40 hours working for somebody else, just spend 80 hours working for yourself. So,
yeah.
So now that you're in your purpose coach and you're in that kind of business, when we initially met you, Marie introduced you as like capitalism with love. So can you explain that concept a little bit?
Absolutely. So the name of my practice is Lead from Love. And to me, it all keeps coming back to love. And I've been collecting definitions of love in various ways. I built various models to explain how I look at love and how work fits into it. And the simplest one that I've come up with is absolute appreciation. That if we can stay humbled in a way that, I think it's really not possible in the human condition to appreciate everything, because we get frustrated and we have all sorts of things that come along. And so this idea of absolute appreciation keeps us grounded and rooted in a kind of humility, right? Actually, it's actually related. It's a good segue. It's related to what I was just saying. Like, I didn't have love for that company I was in, even though, to the point of your question, I was learning, I was growing, there were a lot of really good things happening there. And to some extent, I appreciated that, I suppose, but I spent a lot of time being frustrated. A lot of times, I could do this better, and they don't know what they're doing, and all that. And that's not love to me. That's not appreciating them, or assuming that they have other things going on, or hardships, or that I'm not, the absolute center of that universe. And love to me is appreciating all of it, and appreciating even the things that might seem frustrating, because there's probably some greater gift to that, and some reason that exists that maybe we can't fully see.
Yeah. So, I love that you say that, but I know people would definitely listen to this and find that very, very hard, because I know I definitely do. So, like, what are some of the steps, or like, what is your strategy behind, it's easy to appreciate those things that are working well for you. It's easy to appreciate, making a lot of money, landing a big contract with somebody, or like the successes are really easy to appreciate. But how would you say that somebody would go about appreciating, I guess, the failures and the hardships and the different things that an entrepreneur will have to go through in their career?
Sometimes I wonder if this like celebration of failure, it's like really charged up and like, yeah, let's fail and let's do it. And let's, like I wonder if that kind of excitement is actually covering up some deeper emotion of shame, guilt, fear, sadness, anything like that. And I think that's a lot of how we individually and as a society operate, is we've come up with an infinite array of distractions to get those feelings. And it's a lot of my work now and a lot of research, a lot of my mentors, it all really seems to come back to being with the discomfort of those emotions, and I know I received a lot of conditioning and training. I think we all generally do. And a lot of it's like how we're marketed to as well, to avoid that, right? To avoid those feelings. And in many cases, unless it's like a deep trauma, a feeling only takes about 90 seconds to fully process if we allow it, which is remarkable, because if we avoid it, it might take years. It might be in there sort of affecting us and guiding us in subconscious ways for years. So that's I think the way to appreciate it is to simply be with the emotions that are arising around it and through it. And there is some beauty in there, because that's truth. And that's it. If we can face truth, and and the part I do agree with in the broader sentiment is learning from it. What can we learn from it without dwelling on it?
Yeah, for sure.
I love that you mentioned that, and that even just gave me like a new perspective. So like I really liked how you said that like celebrating failures could be like a cover up, because I just read like 2 books. I'm in the middle of one right now, and they're like about purpose, and the other one was about conversation, but the gist like of both of them was about being present. So like I can like totally relate to what you're saying right now, just because I've been reading so much about being present lately.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing I was kind of thinking is a lot of people might not understand the impact that this might necessarily have on their businesses. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because I found in my entrepreneurial journey, it started off as learning these really hard, tangible skills that you could see. But then there's all of these other skills that a lot of entrepreneurs actually never master, that you cannot see. And a lot of times I feel like they're the most important ones. So could you talk about maybe the effect that, things like, capitalism with love, and also being present might actually, do for somebody's company or their business or whatever it may be that they're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah, it can show up in so many ways. There's some more broad terms. Not everybody identifies with the word love in capitalism, but there's conscious capitalism. There's the B Corp movement. There's small giants. There's a number of flavors that I think are all, whether or not they use the word love, it is very present. I was actually talking to another entrepreneurial colleague of mine the other day, and she was commenting that, as a business owner, it's easier probably most of the time to make decisions from fear. So, I think it's reasonable to put fear and love as poles and look at those together, or hold them in that way. And I do think love can be the way through fear. And we could also call that courage. And, Brene Brown's kind of cornered the market on vulnerability and courage, but it's really wonderful research that she's done.
Yeah.
And she also doesn't use the word love quite so much, but I think it's right in line with all of that. I think, love, lead from love is essentially, learn to love yourself and appreciate everything about you. So then you can move through courage and in spite of or through fear. So in business, the way that shows up, most people, for instance, don't quit their jobs, they quit their managers. So most businesses are drawn or built as hierarchies, which is really left over from a military structure, which in some cases makes sense, but in a lot of cases it doesn't. In a lot of creative fields and service-oriented fields, it actually doesn't make sense to lock everybody into that hierarchy and put everybody in little boxes. And a lot of managers really are using decades old, managerial training that is really about power over and kind of shut up and do your job type of things. And that's just not the way that humans flourish and are motivated to be their best. So, love is a bit of a leap of faith within business because it's letting go of some of that control. It's actually learning to, having the courage to trust that people are going to do their best work if they're not held down in a hierarchy, if they're not, boxed into one little job. And it is trickier in some ways, in terms of doing that at scale, building training programs that support that. But I think it's the human and loving thing to do. And I recall in my business, especially when we got larger, I had 13 full-time employees, that I think a lot of decisions, I remember wanting to do something from love, or wanting to make a more conscious decision, or wanting to offer benefits and things to people, or wanting to be transparent. That's a really big one. Like there's this idea of like open accounting and full transparency with the books. And the companies that do that are tremendously more successful because they're actually crowdsourcing innovation and problem solving all throughout the company. And so the people who are, let's say, the delivery truck driver who, is out there doing delivery has the power, the knowledge, and the wherewithal and the support to make a decision, maybe even change the system, rather than the idea that a few people in a small room at the top of a hierarchy can actually think of everything and let that flow through. So I think transparency, trust, courage, these are all, I think, powered by love, if you will.
Yeah.
So instead of like the hierarchy, it's more so just everyone's kind of the same across the board.
So there are different ways to, break down hierarchy. Part of that, even if there is a manager, so one option would be, even if there is a hierarchy, that managers can be trained to lead people, to coach people. Like you'd say, going from this sort of power over, top down managerial style, trying to hold people down, and sort of, it's like, I don't know, a pot boiling over and just trying to like hold the pot on, but there's this like beautiful human that wants to be fully expressed underneath it,
Yeah.
So that's one way, would just be to change attitudes about leadership and management and how we reinforce that hierarchy or even exaggerate that hierarchy. And then the transparency is another way to do that. I know one example of a company where they have the entire path, like everywhere you could ever possibly go in the company, every job you could ever have is on a big board, and everything you would need to be trained in to get there, and also what the pay rate is for all of those. So everybody in the entire company, even though there is a hierarchy, it's a pizza place, there are managers, everybody understands, it's not about like a manager getting this power and then holding it over everybody. It's actually, the managers are incentivized to like bring everybody along and say, oh, do you want this job? Great. And then here's the path for you to get there. And so that becomes much more of a coaching relationship. Now, on the more advanced side, there are a few different operating systems where businesses actually completely reduce hierarchy. The most popular one, I think, is called holacracy. And it's pretty advanced. It's an all-in model and everything's basically arranged in circles. So there really isn't a strict hierarchy. And I'm familiar with that, but I'm actually much more familiar with one called the collaborative operating system, which is more compartmentalized. It really, the whole thing basically centers around a couple of key concepts. One is that you're always looping back to get ownership and alignment through all of the stakeholders that are involved in any given decision. And that one idea alone is transformative. As I was going through the training, I was just realizing, wow, this is and actually the other one is being explicit, like we were just talking about, like transparency and trust. A lot of that has to do with the maturity of being explicit, asking for what I want, knowing what I want, trusting that I can have a straightforward conversation with somebody about it. Yeah. And if it's a larger group, this idea of ownership and alignment. Do people have ownership, which is like agency? Do they have some access to the power structure here, or a voice where they could change things? And are we aligned? Are we actually all aligned? And the idea there is if you loop through ownership and alignment enough, then you will have nobody left to object. And it's not because in a hierarchy, you might have nobody left to object because, well, in a more civilized way, maybe you just never heard their objections or never gave them a voice. On a less, on a more extreme version, like you killed them all. So that's how a lot of hierarchies have worked throughout history. But this is it feels like a radical model because it distributes the power in a totally different way.
Yeah. And I love that idea as well, too, because it seems to me that we're kind of in we're coming from an age where, like, these companies, they're basically entities, but a lot of times the whole entity is its fate, its future and everything involving, like, revolving around the entity is decided in this small little room by a few people who, aren't doing a lot of the day-to-day operations of it. And in my mind, when you were talking, when I was thinking about a company as being an entity, I was like, every piece of that entity should kind of work together for the greater good of the entire entity. And I thought about kind of, either the human body or even, any type of, living creature. Like, if there is, I guess, a cell in that creature or that human that doesn't align with what the rest of the body actually wants, then that's where you get sickness, disease, and things like cancer from. And I feel like, kind of like what you were saying with the, I forgot what you called it, but I guess the company where everybody has, kind of like an ownership stake and, different ideas and, coming in alignment with that. I feel like that's kind of what it really should be, because that's what a healthy body, that's what a healthy entity should probably consist of. So I feel like that is very revolutionary, and it's crazy that more companies aren't ran like that, because I feel like, just because somebody's a janitor doesn't necessarily make it so that that janitor doesn't have good ideas that could push the company forward. And I feel like his position should necessarily make it so that he does not have a voice or an opinion about, other different types of operations in the company. Because I've actually seen companies where it's like the janitor like just knows everything you could possibly know.
I think
about this company.
that was Nike. Like, we read upon it somewhere, and the janitor at Nike, like, he knew like the backstory and everything. Like, he was like so deep into the company and like why it was even there.
Yeah, for sure.
I love that. A couple things come up. One is, that's part of this idea of lead from love, right? Is seeing that janitor as a whole human being before you see his identity, before you see his background, before you see his role, before you see, right? And just engaging as a human being. And I think that's a lot of capitalism is fundamentally dehumanizing. And that goes in all directions. It's more obvious, I think, with factory workers or janitors and whatnot. But I think leaders are also dehumanized in various ways. They're held to certain standards and not allowed to express certain emotions and various things like that. But I love how you're comparing it to nature. I think I have a colleague actually who compares a lot of work to the cellular structure of the body. And it's like, even like when she had this whole piece talking about boundaries. And it was like just looking at a cellular membrane, and cells let certain things in and they don't let other things out. And this idea of boundaries is so important. And that's a lot of my personal journey lately. I've realized that I have empathic qualities or highly sensitive. There's a few different sort of labels you might put on it, but this idea that I let a lot of energy in from other people. And that can be really exhausting, and it can even lead to not just fatigue, but even, I don't know, even being kind of resentful for that. Like, oh, why I don't want all your energy,
Yeah.
But there are ways to manage those boundaries. Like, there are ways to manage all boundaries in life. And I think that's like a lot of what we're all going through in the social justice discussions, right? Like, well, because some of those boundaries are interpersonal, some of them are systemic, some of them are built on laws that need to be changed. I mean, all sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure.
Since you are a purpose coach, what does the process look like for like employees, and then for like an entire company, like when you work with like these individuals?
For purpose, yeah. So I use a methodology called True Purpose, and it's been around for a little more than 10 years. And so if I'm coaching an individual, like a leader or a CEO, or often it's somebody in transition, somebody who's a little later career, saying, gosh, I've done well in my career, I've checked off all the boxes, the kids are out of the house, I probably got decades left, like what's going on? So maybe that's an existential crisis, maybe that's just a curiosity. So it starts there. It starts with some reason to go into the journey, because it is a journey into the soul, into the heart, and it takes typically about 12 sessions, ideally weekly, so 12 weeks. And there's quite a bit of journaling and introspection, meditation. There's all these different tools that we deploy. And it really, it is an act of self-love, I believe, to go through this journey, as any transformational journey, and to hold, again, to be in that discomfort, because what we're generally doing is, peeling back the layers of ego and conditioning that we all tend to pick up from the world as we go. It's just a natural part of how we socialize and how we develop our own sense of identity and our place in the world. And, gently, and I never call that wrong either. I think that's part of the journey, and it's an important part of how we develop. And yet there's some value to picking that apart and finding, well, what is that? What is the soul really yearning for? Mm-hmm. And and we call that purpose. We can call it a lot of different things. We call it a calling. I like that term too, because it's the sense that there's something greater, some other energy, some other greater force that's really calling us forth. Mm-hmm. That's more what true purpose is about. It's not for everybody. Some people, and I have no criticism or opinion of this, if some people would prefer to say, yeah, I have a purpose and I'm just going to sort of make it up today, and that's what it is. And that's okay. That's great. So I think to some extent, each of us are living our purpose all the time. And so a bit of it is a question of, how dim is that signal gotten, and how can we get back to that? Because I know when we are living on purpose, and I know this for me and all the people I work with and my colleagues, that there's a sense of fulfillment. And I keep sort of tinkering with the idea of like a universal, purpose for humanity. I won't be so bold as to know that I could do that, but it seems to almost always relate back to service of some kind, which I think also relates to love. And that's what's really neat about this particular process about the soul work, because when we're getting to that level, we're not listening to the part of the mind that's fearful. We're respecting that part. Actually, the very first part of the whole journey is to look at the fear, be with it, actually develop a kind of partnership and get permission from those parts of ourselves, because they're really important parts of ourselves that are protecting us and keeping us safe and all these things. So there is a respect for that. And then to say, okay, do you mind just holding on for a moment while we go over here and listen to the heart? And that voice that comes out, we call it trusted source. And it could be, I define a trusted source as a voice of pure love, because I've never, ever heard a trusted source really say anything that was spiteful or say anything. They seem to have infinite patience. They are very wise. It's tapping into these parts of ourselves that have this perhaps infinite wisdom that gets a bit cluttered and covered up by a lot of the other things we experience in life. And it is remarkable through my own relationship with my trusted source, and as I coach clients to meet their trusted source and get this energetic wisdom, just how powerful it is, how truthful it is, how, I don't know, it's funny, it's not really sensational I mean, sometimes, the goal actually is to get a really strong emotional reaction. That's how we actually measure the quality of the purpose information. Mm-hmm. But often it just feels like this plain truth that's coming through. And that's the moment when it's like, yep, that's it. That just feels right.
Yeah.
So that's at an individual level. I'll pause there, see if there are any other questions, then I can talk more about organization.
No, just a quick comment. Like, it's funny that you say, trying to lean, respecting the fear, but also trying to lean more towards like this purpose and love and different things of that nature. Mm-hmm. And I just thought it was really interesting how, like you said, a lot of people try to make it so that they're not fearful of anything. And you're saying basically, don't make it so that you're not fearful of things, but make it so that you respect that fear, but you don't have to let it control you. And I really like that, because what I've noticed a lot of times in business is, well, for me, just to back up a little bit, I feel like fear is mainly a biological trigger that kind of protects you from, bodily harm. I feel like at the base level, that's what fear is for, is to keep you from harm's way, really. The whole fight or flight thing. But it's as human beings, what I've noticed is that a lot of times it shows up in, our relationships and our business, where there's no real danger of bodily harm. Like, you could probably get your feelings hurt, but other than that, it's like there's no real unsurmountable danger in that, but it still feels the same. Like
it's caused in the mind.
Yeah, it's like there's been times in my business where it's felt like fight or flight, but I feel like that type of reaction just doesn't necessarily have a place in certain aspects of life, such as business and a lot of different relationships. So I like how you touched on that, because I feel like a lot of times I was trying to ignore this fear instead of acknowledging it. And then after acknowledging it, focusing on that thing that would actually help me, be of service to people, instead of, mainly being of service to myself.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a lot of the conscious leadership work and some of the neuroscience that I've read about it basically illustrates that exact concept, and the idea that our minds actually can't tell the difference between a physical fear, being chased by a tiger or whatever, and like an emotional fear or a social fear, right? That we're gonna be rejected by the tribe is one of the, I think, deepest fears that we all share, because deep in our DNA is the idea that if we got kicked out of the tribe, we would die, because we, I think this is part of the dysfunction we're experiencing now. We are, as a species, we are completely interdependent. I mean, in so many ways, and yet somehow my sense is that might be less obvious. The more we build a world where, well, I don't know where it's like, where does your food come from? Well, it comes from the grocery store. No, really, where's your food come from?
Yeah.
That we're just, oddly, in a world where we have more access to information, than ever. I think in many ways we're also disconnected from ourselves, from each other, from nature in various ways. And maybe that's just the fire hose nature of it. It's just like, oh my gosh, there's so much. But yeah, that's what's coming up for me right now when you're talking about that, and this idea of fear, I think, plays into that this fear of disconnection and loneliness is very deep and really real for a lot of people. And sometimes that they can't even survive that, And so I think this is where love comes in, and I think organizations provide an incredible infrastructure for people to love each other and just care for each other. And it's not romance or sex or anything like that. It's just like, how can we take care of each other in these environments? And I think the more business can support that, because it's already built the infrastructure, it's already gathered all the people, and most of them are miserable. So how do we?
So it seems like with like the organizational level, that's where love would probably come in the most, right? Because everybody's like you said, we're interdependent upon each other. So with the organizational purpose process, like how do you work through that process, like for the whole organization?
Yeah, so I talked a bit about this connection to trusted source, this connection to, energetic wisdom, the voice of love. And that is an essential part of this process moving into the organization as well. We actually call that direct access. This idea of talking directly to that source of wisdom and energy versus an indirect method, which is what most purpose work is, which is more of a brainstorm, more of a triangulation. When were we, what are our roots? Why was this company founded? What are we passionate about? Those kinds of things. And again, I'm not here to criticize that, but it tends to be less powerful, less juicy. That's why a lot of purpose statements, sadly, even in like not-for-profits, a lot of the mission statements are these kind of watered-down, committee-written statements, because that's what tends to happen. You tend to compromise on, like, what's the language everybody can kind of agree on? Okay, great, whatever. and it's not something people are. They're probably, especially in a not-for-profit, they're probably super passionate about the actual mission, but the way it's written. Probably not so much. Probably most people couldn't even recite it or remember it. So with true purpose, the first part of the process is connecting leaders to that trusted source. And so I actually just completed a process with a manufacturer that really, beginning to end, is about 1 year. And because there was a process of working with 7 individual leaders to walk through the individual purpose process, and then go into the collective process, which we actually added 3 more people. There were 10 people in the room. And this was really beautiful. There was a series of 3 separate workshops. And the first one was me leading them through a guided meditation to access this trusted source. And they're all journaling whatever they get and just letting it flow. And this is a big part of the practice. Actually, I want to emphasize that it is a practice like anything else in life, right? This is something, even though it's intuition, which would be another way to think about all this, the voice of intuition, even though it's part of us, for whatever reason, just because we're human, it really does take practice to connect to the voice. So we usually say, keep talking at least once a week, if not more, formally having written journaling dialogues and whatnot. So in that first session, it was so beautiful, the information that they all got. It was all totally different. And then the question is, how do we piece this together? So then the second workshop is, that I've sorted the information into 4 different aspects of purpose. And essentially the difference is a being state, which is an essence. And then there's 2 states of doing. So one of those we call the blessing, like the daily doing of purpose. Like, how do we actually show up each day? And I think that's the most actionable, because that's like, how do we love each other each day? Mm-hmm. How do we show up and care for each other? And then the third we call the mission, which is like that North Star, that aspirational, like, what's the line on the horizon that we're all aligned to, coming back to alignment. And how do we use that to make decisions? Like, oh, wow, we've really gotten off track. Or, wow, this really didn't go that well. Or, wow, should we take this gig, that just doesn't seem like anybody's excited about? And there's an important notion there in business, actually, I'll circle back to that. So the 4th part is message. Like, what is the universal wisdom that we've been entrusted to kind of share with the world, just to button that up. But there's an important part about the idea of how purposeful a person or a company can be at any given time. Mm-hmm. And it might be possible for a person to be just almost like 100%, just always devoted to purpose. And I think that's, or maybe actually I'm just hedging slightly there, because it's just, it's a challenge for anybody, I think. But for a company, it's very, very challenging. In fact, I don't think the expectation should be that a company would be 100% purposeful all the time, because there's so much more complexity, and a company is obviously affected by market conditions, and most of the market, I would argue, is not loving or conscious or purposeful. So
Yeah.
there are times, and here's where transparency is really, really important, and where purpose can help, because we could say, look, we know that we would all not like to take this gig because it is not in line with our purpose. And some of you are going to have to be working on this, and you're not, and you were here because of the purpose, and that's what excites us. And however, we need this revenue, right? We need this revenue to keep moving ahead so that we can fulfill our purpose tomorrow. And we can fulfill it in other ways. And I think that's a way that purpose can be used in a company to make those hard choices. And again, it goes back to the transparency, right? In a lot of companies, there would be a hierarchy where somebody would decide that in a locked room and maybe never tell anybody. Maybe they would use their purpose as a decision-making tool, maybe not. But where it's really powerful is if everybody can know that together and have a say in that, and say, you know, this is what we see as the best path forward, that we should do this work, and then we'll be able to look at the bigger arc of our mission, and we'll be fulfilling that more later on, versus if we, you know, go out of business, right? And then nobody, we're all going our separate ways.
Yeah, for sure.
So do you think that it's like almost necessary to sacrifice like that, maybe like not fulfilling your purpose at that moment, but for like fulfilling it like over time, like just overall? So like, is that okay? Like,
yeah, I think her main question is kind of like, is purpose, is it a daily thing, or is it more so like over the span of like 10 years? Like, because I mean, there's different moments where kind of like you said, you know, I'm there's probably a week where I don't think about like my company's mission. Like it's so many things to worry about. I just don't think about it at all for like maybe an entire week. But then there's some other weeks where it's like I can totally pass up on a opportunity that is probably worth like thousands of dollars, and just to specifically focus on my purpose. So is it more so would you say that is more so a marathon, and there's times where you maybe get sidetracked, or is it something that you have to adhere to like strictly every day, day in and day out?
Great question. You know, one of the, you know, whether it's individual or a company, we always ask a question. There's essentially 5 stages of the process. The first 2 are about the fear and resistance. Then the next 2 are about purpose and writing the statements, talking to the trusted source. Then the 5th stage we call manifestation. And this is, okay, we're going to build a strategic plan for purpose. And the first question I ask is, well, how purposeful a life do you want to live, whether you're a leader or a company, on a scale of 1 to 10? And so we quantify that and we'll calibrate it. So if you're a 10, then I'd want to calibrate that. So you're making almost all of your decisions based on purpose, and really thinking about that on a daily basis, and working with that, and checking in with your trusted source on all big decisions. But if you're on the lower end of the scale, maybe not so much, you know. And I think if I interpreted what you just said correctly, that it's easy to lose touch, whether that's falling back into old patterns, behaviors, or just whatever, life happens, and just losing touch and needing a break. I know this has happened for me in my meditation practice a couple times. I've just sort of fallen off and just had to start over and rebuild it, you know, and then that's okay. So that's one of the reasons we distinguish. I mean, true purpose is an incredibly detailed amount of purpose information. So it's one of the reasons we distinguish between this blessing and this mission. So the blessing is like the daily doing. And we actually get such a level of detail as to know your blessing steps. It's like, how do you bless other people in your life? And it's abstract enough that it can be applied to lots of different areas of life, your home and your relationship at home, your business, your family, just going to the grocery store, meeting a person on the street. There's a version of your blessing every day. And the idea is the more that you are living that and honoring that and all the steps in that, then the more you're living your purpose, and the more fulfilling it'll be. It's really cool because you can use your blessing looking forward, like, oh, how should I approach this particular task or project or relationship? And I need to actually look at the steps of my blessing to make sure I'm being purposeful. Or retroactively say, wow, that thing really did not go very well. Like what? And I know if I do that, sometimes I'll like, well, I skipped the first 2 steps of my blessing, so maybe that's why that didn't go so well. So that can be this daily tool, or even hourly, the moment to moment tool that you're using. And then the other part of it, like you said, 10-year or that North Star, that's a little bit more about the mission. What is the arc? What are the guardrails? And this is actually where values come into, because I think of values as like the guardrails, right? Like that are going to keep us pointed. That if mission is like that destination, and blessing is this daily process, then the values can keep us on track in another way and help us. Like, I don't know exactly all the details, but you're saying, when I turned down a several $1,000 deal, yeah, I mean, if those aren't aligned with our values, there was a banker doing a conscious capitalism thing a few weeks ago, and he was saying, when the mortgage crisis hit, they were looking at all these subprime loans and just saying, this doesn't make any sense to us. This is just not, these people can't afford these loans. Like it doesn't line up with our values. And so they passed on all of it. And obviously that worked out better for them. And so I think it's both. And I guess what's also coming up for me right now is, explaining it could just seem like a lot. It could seem like, all this structure and all this daily stuff and this process I have to follow. And, that for a while, I think maybe it feels that way when you're learning or practicing. And then eventually I like to think that a lot of that strict process can fall away to a state of flow, to just realizing like, oh, this is, we call it synchronicity. This is how I flow through the world. And when things do just line up, and when things, and it's interesting with opportunities, whether you believe that living on purpose actually makes more opportunities show up, which is possible, or if you just are noticing them more because you're spending more time in that state of love versus the fear of gossip and complaining and all that. And when you're in that energy, it's really hard to see opportunities and see new ways of solving problems.
So kind of both.
Yeah, for sure.
So we talked a lot about like the connectedness, and you mentioned how we as like humans aren't as connected like as we should be. So you were telling us about like your Feel Real, about the project that you're working on. So could you tell our audience what it is and the great things about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Feel Real, it's interesting. In some way, it's been incubating for about 12 years. It came to me as a vision and a dream, which a couple of years ago I confirmed with, I would meet my trusted source, 10 years later. And then I asked her, it's like, hey, wait a minute, was that you in that dream? It's like, yeah, that was me. So it's, even back in 2007, I was recognizing how crappy people can be to each other on the internet. And obviously that's not limited to the internet, but it seemed like it exaggerated it in a way.
Oh, yeah, by a lot.
like, what is this? Yeah, why do we just stop, And so I was, back then, I believed a lot of it had to do with not being in real time, right? If we just sort of show up to what's left of a conversation and a bunch of like threaded comments, and we just drop one and then we take off. It's really not an interaction,
Yeah.
Like, and I don't really like to think in absolutes. So, I was looking at, there was a thread on Facebook earlier today that where people disagreed and they very politely handled that and it was fine and they respected each other. So it's not to say it's impossible, but it's
rare.
It's rare. And as we all observe, and I thought there were a couple of big problems. One was not being real time and then trying to do things in really big groups. Like, oh, let's have 100 people try to have a conversation or a few thousand people try to have a conversation. It's just a mess. It's not really a conversation. I think it's a fundamental limitation of human beings. We cannot actually maintain intimacy in our relationships with that many people at once. And this has a lot to do with what we're talking about, right? Like, because then the fear and the guarding kind of comes in. the social pressure that, oh, now this is a totally different thing. And it's very natural, happens to maybe all of us, or at least a lot of us. The third that I was concerned about back then was anonymity, but I don't even think that's the biggest challenge. You know, I think even on Facebook, where people, you could probably still see somebody's name,
Yeah.
you know, that happens. So, so I've spent the last, 12 years looking at the world through this lens. You know, that morning I got up and it was my flux capacitor moment, if anybody remembers Back to the Future. And I don't know how old your audience is, but, and I wrote this out and I still have it, these like 7 pieces of paper. And what it is being built now and released soon. So thanks for asking about it. And along the way, I did pick up the name Feel Real, because the other major component I realized, and a lot of this has to do with my training as a coach and just a lot of things that are emerging around emotional intelligence and vulnerable leadership and all of that, is this emotional component to it. That's actually, I think, when that fear you were talking about, when we react and in the middle of a conversation and we feel like we're being threatened, that's when we're going to put up our armor, take a step back, and maybe even start throwing stones or something worse, right? And so there's this, and that's all that much more heightened when we're talking about really contentious subjects. Or, like we talked a bit about, my own journey around my recognizing, whiteness and the deeper history of this nation and how we all came to be here. And those discussions, and that's really where I'm personally putting myself more and more, is to hold space for those types of discussions, because I think that those are conversations that need to happen. We need to figure out a way for them to happen, and they are happening. And that's one of the things about looking at the world through this lens for all these years. I've been meeting all the people that are holding space in various ways and for these real-time dialogues. And a lot of them are offline, a lot of them are in person, some of them are online. And so Feel Real, the vision is that millions of people are in these small group real-time dialogue circles that are facilitated, and they're holding space for each other, and they're sharing these vulnerable stories and really getting into deeper truths, and particularly holding space for that emotional journey. And I think where things, there's a critical moment when somebody has a really strong trigger or an emotion, when we can retreat, or we can actually come closer together. If we're vulnerable, we can come closer together. And so that's the purpose of Feel Real, is to bring together hearts that have been divided by minds. Because we could say that the fear that we're talking about is a quality of the mind, right? Because there's a reaction, and then there's a story built about it, like that's a danger. And then if we grab onto that story, then the mind is actually, maintaining and reinforcing the fear. So that's it. So I'm, building this. Part of it's a platform. Part of it's actually emerging as a consultancy to bring this idea of training, not only holding space and holding these circles, and also training people how to hold that space, so this can expand exponentially.
Yeah. And I feel like that's an amazing project, because when I look at social media, after we had our first conversation, I actually took a closer look at social media, and it's became this huge, absolutely massive numbers game. And like the people, like everybody's worried about having a ton of followers, especially, when you're an entrepreneur in business trying to build a brand, you're worried about having a ton of followers. And a lot of times when somebody actually has succeeded in creating a very, very large following, a lot of times what the following is doing is talking to the person that facilitated the following. And there's not a lot of conversation going on between the followers themselves. And
even with that though, like people, they want a lot of followers, but they don't want to follow a lot of people. Like for Instagram, for example.
Oh yeah.
Like
definitely.
they'll only follow like 200 people, but then like they'll have like 24,000 followers. Like there's no connections.
Yeah. I guess if you're the president, that's one thing. But if you're
like I think Beyonce doesn't follow anybody at all. 0 people, but has millions of followers.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of times it's that disconnect that you're kind of talking about, like there's, thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people, flocking after this individual. And a lot of times the people following that person aren't saying, hey, we have this thing in common. Like, what stories could we share between ourselves? Because a lot of those people who like follow Beyonce or whoever it is, that the reality of it is they're most of them, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of them are not going to have a chance to have a more intimate relationship and conversation with her. But there may be somebody in that following that you actually can have a more intimate conversation and relationship with, and there might be a lot of value that you could add to each other. So I really like how your project is going to break down, like, these millions of people that are on social media and try to like put them in smaller groups. And I feel like it'll foster a sense of more of a sense of, I can actually, one, be heard, and people will actually care what I'm talking about because it's only like a group of like 10 of us or whatever, or even less. And not only can I be heard, but what I actually have to say, it matters to somebody. And I can actually get to know these people, and I could be more of myself, because I feel like if I'm like, I did like one of my first speaking engagements not too long ago, I wanted it to be a big crowd, but it was probably a blessing that it actually was not a big crowd, because I was more of myself than I probably otherwise would have been if, freaking 100 people had showed up, or whatever the case may be. So I feel like that's an awesome project, and I feel like it'll benefit a lot of people, especially if you can have conversations on different subjects. So like the one you brought up is also another one I was kind of thinking about when you were talking, was like cyberbullying, because that's became a huge thing in our society. And I feel like some people underestimate how serious that is, because it's on the internet. So it seems more benign, but at the same time, I kind of think of not only what is said, because some people, have the strength to kind of shrug it off, but at the same time, what does that say about, the compassion that exists in our society now, or like thereof compassion. And it kind of points back to what you were saying about, having these huge, massive, comment sections for people to just say whatever they want and then leave and then never read what you said back. And I feel like the Feel Real project would kind of alleviate that, because now you have to have a dialogue with this person. And now, like, if you do say something like very rude or off-putting to somebody, you kind of have to deal with the consequences of what they say back, or what other people are going to say to you about what you had to say to them. So I feel like it's a simple idea, and I'm surprised that it hasn't like somebody hasn't tried to, I guess, bring it into existence before, because I feel like it's really, really needed.
Thank you for saying that. And as you were talking, those beautiful examples, I was just thinking about hierarchy, and in the example of like somebody on Twitter with millions of followers, that's a kind of celebrity hierarchy, right? There's like one person like with power and attention, and everybody is following them, and then the other, like a bully, right? That's like a micro hierarchy, a micro social hierarchy, right? Probably based on some lack in life, earlier life, as a generic, guess. And there's this something lacking, and I figure out one day I have, if it's in the physical world, maybe I have physical power over somebody else, or in the internet, it sort of, I guess, flattens that physicality. And so that, like other kinds of ways to push people around show up. And it can be a way, it's obviously a way that we fill in, we can accommodate for some of those things that we're lacking in life. And that, so, one shift that a variety of people talk about is this difference between power over and shifting that to power with. And, why doesn't this exist? Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying that, and I hope you're right, so this can thrive. And part of what I think will make this different too is it's not just going to be based on everybody flocking to one new platform. The idea is that we really respect the autonomy and the space of all of these people who are already doing all these various projects, and find a way to, respect that space there where they've established it in their communities, because that's critically important, and also provide a footprint within the overall platform so people can cross-pollinate and get to know each other. Like you were saying, like, wow, I bet a bunch of Beyonce's Twitter followers might have a lot in common, and or might have a lot to talk about. And then eventually, once that critical mass is there, driving that to collective action, right? Like the people, the 8 people who are like, I mean, more and more, I think a lot of people are looking around at the world and just saying, wow, there's so many things we want to work on. And it can feel like we're weighted down, and that's impossible, just the scope of it, or held down by the systems we're all participating in. And that's true. And the power of small groups, throughout history has been proven that that's how change starts. That's how change gets done. And picking up, I think, I don't know if you were frustrated by it, but for me, I mean, when I had my agency, we grew beyond web design. We were a digital agency, software development, all these things. I became really excited about the power of social media in 2007, 2008. And then I quickly became really disillusioned and sort of sad about it, because it was commoditized, turned into a big ad network, basically reinforcing the hierarchies we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation that I think we're fundamentally addicted to. I think that's a lot of our challenge. Like, when we talk about, when we scale this up to like the consciousness of our entire species, like, can we evolve beyond this addiction to the hierarchies that we're in?
Yeah.
So we are very excited for you to finish this project, because it's like, as everyone listening can see, it is needed so much.
Very, very much.
So what is the number one takeaway that you want people to walk away with from this episode?
Learn to love yourself. And, I think the main thing that comes up with that in this moment for me is respect your own boundaries.
Yeah.
And know how to, once you establish those, know how to share them with people in a way that is also loving.
Yeah.
It starts with the self. So once you love yourself, then you can love everyone else. And then, that's when it gets to the organization, and then the organization can just flourish.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's a great takeaway.
Yeah. So because you're on an Abundant Culture podcast, we have to ask this question. How do you, in your line of work, in your life, and everything that you do, how do you spread abundance?
How do I spread abundance? Well, to me, a lot of it is the attitude of abundance. And it's so much of what we've talked about. I mean, we could easily exchange abundance and scarcity for love and fear. If we're operating from that place of fear, then we're going to hoard things out of fear of scarcity. And interestingly, we seem to live in a time where we believe that things are scarce that really aren't, like love, and then we believe things are abundant that really aren't, like our natural resources. And so the way we're behaving is kind of interposed there. So, my own way of doing that is loving myself, living a purposeful life, because all of those things help me maintain an attitude of abundance and believing in abundance, believing that we have everything we need for everybody on earth to live in an abundance. But to be careful that isn't just material abundance. Like the way we live in the US on average is not sustainable if everybody in the world did that. So it's also clarifying that idea of love and spiritual abundance, that to me being the most important kind versus material abundance.
For sure. That's awesome.
And I love that you made that distinction, because when people think of abundance, a lot of times they do think of like material abundance. So like, oh, I'm gonna get this big old house and the nice cars, and I'm just gonna go sit on my yacht because I live in abundance. So I really like that you just broke down the two different types of abundance, really.
So I'm pretty sure people are going to watch this podcast and maybe they're going to be more interested in your, Feel Real project, or maybe they just want to learn more about purpose and how to find theirs, or just how to be compassionate while still being a capitalist at the same time. And they're going to need a way to reach out to you. So what's the best way to actually contact you and reach out to you?
Absolutely. So my coaching and consulting work, you can find me at leadfromlove.io, as well as some models I've developed around love and other areas, and all my contact information is on there, and social media, all that fun stuff. And then the Feel Real project will be at feelreal.net, and that's coming soon. So.
Awesome.
That's incredible. Thank you.
So we absolutely loved this conversation, and we wanted to make sure we didn't take too much of your time because it definitely could have went on longer, because this is a conversation that is needed, especially in entrepreneurship, because in entrepreneurship everybody gets so wrapped up in just like material things again, and not really like living in love and expressing love, because then it comes that they have to be like this hard CEO that is like mean and stern. So this conversation was like so needed.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Yes. So thank you for coming on to the Abundant Culture podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. I love all the work you're doing, and yes, I feel like we could keep talking for a few hours. So.
Definitely.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you.
So that's all we have for today, folks. I hope you got as much value out of this as we did. Keep in mind, the only way we can improve is through constructive feedback. So remember to rate and review this episode. Also, you are not the only person that needs to know this super valuable information. So be sure to subscribe and share as well. Stay tuned for the next episode. And remember to always spread abundance. Peace.